Episode 12. Herbs, Flowers, and Berries. Not worth a thing. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, I'll be looking at the ultimate perishables of 17th century American food. With no refrigeration and practically no sugar, for the most part, it was eat it now, dry it out, pickle it, or let it go. So pull up to your place at the table, and let's dig in. Before I get going, I need to let you know, as summer arrives, because I, my friends, and family all have their shots, I get to go on some outdoor adventures, have some celebrations, and I get to go back to my not work-from-home site for the first time in over a year. This requires a plane. Due to all these things, this podcast will go into every other week mode. Like Prince Humperdinck, I've got my country's 500th anniversary to plan, my wedding to arrange, my wife to murder, and Gilder to frame for it. I'm swamped. My plans are a bit less momentous and definitely less murdery, but there suddenly are a lot of them. Now, after Labor Day, it will be mostly back to the regular schedule. But for now, let's look at pretty flowers and other things. Looking around here in the 21st century, where herbs, tiny greens, flowers, and berries run the gamut from seasonings, decorations, and treats, and except for some of the flowers, are available fresh year-round. The way we see these perishables is markedly different from how they were regarded by the 17th century colonists. In general, herbs and flowers and berries were the province of women, and farm women most particularly. Yes, physicians and naturalists, the people writing books about them, were men, but the people who daily gathered, dried, brewed, and administered the syrups, waters, decoctions, and other sweetmeats made from them were women working from their kitchen gardens, hedgerows, forest edges, and still rooms. Now, in the British Atlantic, unlike the Dutch and Spanish and somewhat the French, most of the colonists in the 17th century were men, and townmen, soldiers, and laborers at that. With the English, curious-minded naturalists and philosophers would only arrive in the 18th century. And unlike the Spanish and Dutch especially, who sent many women who were used to running farms, businesses, encomiendas, and estates, the English women that were early arrivals to the British colonies were mostly from two categories: town women with limited plant identification experience, and servants and orphan girls who generally lacked knowledge of the arts of practical botany. For in the separatist and Protestant cross-currents of the time, women were known to be fragile in mind and body, and must be protected from sinister and nefarious influences, and contact with rough and savage peoples. Yet they were also expected to shoulder the work of childbearing and the heavy lifting and fire of the cooking hearth. In this atmosphere of contradiction and watchfulness, plant knowledge and beer brewing were the domain of women, yet over-familiarity with applied botany always teetered on the edge of witchery. Witness the witch trials and banishments that peppered all of New England and left scars on several small communities in the 17th century. As a result, the separatist wives limited their plant lore, and the orphaned and pauper teenagers and women sent to the New World to keep house for the breadless and beerless men of Virginia, their training and education leaned far more into scripture, cleanliness, and mending, and the brewing of proper beer with hops. It would most certainly veer away from herb lore, decoctions, curiosity, and the brewing of medicinal ales and wines. But on the other hand, with contracted worms and parasites due to close daily contact with animals and dung, the ongoing scourges of malaria, fevers, smallpox, skin rashes, and a multitude of digestive troubles, the colonists were still in want of cures, or at least concoctions that gave the hope of cures. And so practical botany limped along, and that is where the perishables of the New World came in. Food preparation manuals and recipe collections of the late Middle Ages through the 17th century were divided up into cookery, things served at meals, and sweetmeats, which included conserves, syrups, pastes, waters, and wines, and were regarded more as a pharmacopoeia than they were as dessert offerings. During the 17th century, all the food of a meal was served together: sweets, savory, sours, and dishes that combined all these tastes. Sweet items as a separate dessert did not really emerge until the 18th century. For the 17th century cook and eater, as spring sprung, there was always initial relief at being able to break up the dwindling, months-long, monotonous diet of dried, salted, pickled, and preserved everything. At last, there was fresh food, but not lots, and it wasn't very filling. For most people, there would be some hunger as food from the last harvest and the winter's butchering ran out. And many of these spring exclusives were regarded more as medicine than they were ever seen as food. The first thing to appear would be the green spring shoots. We now know these early greens were important because of their vitamin C content. But to anyone wobbling on the edge of scurvy with loosening teeth, swelling joints, fatigue from anemia, and other issues, those early greens were firmly known to be a tonic. They would clean you out and pep you up. Good for what ails ya. Quick side note. At this point in history, it was believed that the scurvy sailors got on boats, which was really a new disease for them due to the ability to sail offshore with preserved foods. And then what people suffered from on land were two different diseases. The sailor's scurvy was cured by simply a return to land, but the land scurvy was cured by eating foods from the earth. Extra fun fact, Chinese sailors had solved this by growing ginger root in pots on their ships and adding that to their ship's rations. Back to those spring greens. Those bitter and astringent flavors were refreshing after dull winter food. Salt fish, dried apples and squashes, porridges of peas and grains. That bitter flavor was how everyone knew they were working. The very newest shoots might be mild, but most spring greens arrive with defense chemicals to keep them from being eaten. These chemicals often worked on people and their livestock as mild vermifuges or worm ejectors. So the most potent leaves like tansy or pokeweed had to be eaten moderately. We now have less chancy and more effective methods of ejecting worms and other intestinal parasites. Also, blanching and boiling things like dandelion, purslane, lamb's quarters, plantago, also known as leaf plantain, in a few changes of water, got rid of much of the bitterness and the accompanying poisons. But other spring greens were appreciated for their strong flavors, like sharply sour sorrel, refreshing mints, and the tips of spruce trees, peppery hot cress, and oniony ramps and wild onions. Colonists did get to know some of the local vegetation, but they mostly stuck with the plants that were identifiable as cousins to what they knew back home, or they grew plants from seeds they had brought with them. And just so you know, it was this first wave of colonists who first brought dandelions to American shores, because they were, and are, a hardy, adaptable, tenacious early spring green, and every single part was useful and edible. And for what it's worth, my grandfather loved dandelion greens, but even he only wanted the very first tender spring shoots. Due to the mental luggage of already knowing what was food and what was medicine, added to the mix of superiority and fear with which they regarded the Native Americans, and the custom of women from both cultures not mixing with each other, it took a long time for plant knowledge of the East Coast to make it to colonial homes, and much of it never did get there. So green shoots and early herbs would get a mixed reception. Some were greeted with excitement and relief, and others were eaten just grudgingly, often coming to be associated with times of bitterness, tragedy, and want. But then there was the arrival of flowers and berries. These were greeted with excitement by men, women, and children. Flowers were edibles for everyone. The ends of clover flowers were mild and tasted of sweet grass. The blossoms of nasturtiums were spicy. Dandelion blooms were fresh. The wild roses could be made into the always necessary rose water. And honeysuckles, they just lived up to their name. Even trees like maple, ash, elm, elder, and sumac all offered tasty blossoms that anyone could gather. They may also have been medicine, but they were so good everyone would just nab a few to eat as they appeared. And blossoms were also pickled and brined. Nasturtiums, ash, maple, and dandelions, daylilies, and marigolds made excellent condiments, relishes, as well as medicaments. And some would be steeped in aquavit, or even made into wine. Squash blossoms were also cooked as an early vegetable, though those had to be harvested with care. Only the male ones, for female blossoms made the squashes, which were needed for the next fall and winter. After the short-lived flowers came the best treat of all, berries. The east coast of North America, in fits and starts, bursts with berries. The familiar gooseberries, mulberries, elderberries, raspberries, and blackberries. And the new ones for the colonists, huckleberries, hawthorns, strawberries, blueberries, and more I'm totally missing. As modern people in 21st century America, we have come to have a very different relationship with berries. We see them as a year-round food. We prefer them raw, and we regard them as expensive. But for the colonists, berries were things just about anyone could pick while they lasted, available to all for simply the time they took to gather. In fact, their gathering was often a task for children, and due to the 17th century general aversion to raw plant foods, other than some snacking on the sly, berries were mostly cooked into pies and puddings, made into syrups, dried into pastes, sort of like a rough fruit leather, and conserved for sauces, added to gruits for ales, and crushed into wines. Unlike everything else I have talked about so far, herbs, flowers, and berries were not commodities. They were not gathered by the ton and sent back to the home country as debt repayment or profit. These were products, natives of or naturalized to the colonies. They stayed there. These greens, flowers, berries, and their concoctions were homely things, made and administered by women, and they lacked any sort of market. Further, in the 17th century, it was a mark of shame to be a woman whose name was known by strangers. Even in the 18th century, as women began to publish cookery books, they were published anonymously, under such authorships as The Receipt Collection of a Gentlewoman, or By a Lady Printed for the Author. After a lady's death, her family recipe collection might be published, but never while she was living. Notoriety was an embarrassment to be avoided. After all, pride is one of the deadly sins. So in the eyes of the colonists, seeking ever more ways to either pay off those debts for transit and equipping, or to make piles of money for furnishing a luxury lifestyle or creating an empire, sure, those herbs, greens, flowers, and berries, they were tasty. They added enjoyment to the fish and meat and corn and rye and peas and beans. But because they were available to everyone, they were of no particular value to anyone. When it came to decreasing a debt or building up wealth, they were not worth a thing. The commodity-focused colonial mindset had a particular way of valuing things. Generally, raw materials that could be made into saleable goods like salt or deer hide had one value. Finished products like saltfish or shoes that had a nice long shelf life and could survive storage and shipping had another. Luxury items like silk, saffron, or ambergris were in another class altogether. And items that were made by a skilled artisan you had commissioned or by a serf or slave you owned were prized for their uniqueness. No one else, no matter the money, could have another. But items that could be made at home, of everyday use, particularly items made by women, homespun cloth, syrups to calm coughs, leather bags, mattresses stuffed with fresh meadow straw, because they were so common and could be made by any civilized woman, they rarely came into the calculation of what was of value. And these foods that sprang from the ground and grew on trees that appeared to need neither tending nor care fell into this class of valuelessness. Or, as time passed and things changed, into a class of sort of conditional value. for strange things were happening in the life of vegetable foods outside of the small worlds of these early colonies. In France, the cultivation of a wider variety of vegetables for wider purposes was underway. François-Pierre Lafarenne was promoting the careful cooking of vegetables for both their appearance and flavor, making them into dishes all of themselves. Borrowing from and learning from ways of cooking practiced around the edges of the Mediterranean, Lafarenne was beginning a process of tipping medieval cuisine on its side and dumping out much of the spice. So in France, the keeping of gardeners to grow a multitude of delicate and carefully tended vegetables was becoming an object of wealthy display. As the West African market in enslaved people picked up, chunks of culture carried in the heads and hearts of these captives were planted all over the colonies. Native Americans and West Africans met, either as co-fugitives or as master and slave, and other plant knowledge was exchanged, mixed together and preserved. Both of these people normally dined on a wide range of plants and used multiple plant parts, not just as medicine or as a last resort to stave off famine, but as regular food, root to fruit, and the whole year round. These new plants and ways of using vegetable foods were arriving through the kitchen doors of the mighty, but not the knowledge of where to find them, cultivate them, or prepare them. Variety in vegetables on a dining table would become a mark of wealthy display in the colonies, even as wide knowledge of the plants and their habits remained either the province of odd naturalists clambering about with their notebooks and watercolors, women suspected of dabbling in witchcraft, or they were labeled as, quote, known and used by only Negroes and Indians, unquote. And another thing the European colonists missed, most especially because of the depletion of the Native American populations that went on just before and alongside their arrival, was that many of these bonanza patches of berries, edible greens, and delectable blooms had not been placed for them simply by Providence. What no colonist understood, nor due to the cultural blinders they wore could ever know, was that many of these miraculous patches of blueberries, or streamside bounties of cress, or long hedges of wild roses were often jealously tended areas for foraging. The Garden of Eden feeling that there were these bountiful patches of plenty, this was a result of selective tending to propagate a particular item in a particular place so they would be there every year. Part of the reason these patches and bowers and orchards seemed to have no human attendance was partly because the tending was woven into an annual harvest routine. But much more was due to that East Coast epidemic that had wiped out many of the New England coastal tribes in the 5 years before English colonists had started digging in. Down around Virginia, where the colonists were almost all male, with almost no families, so almost no English women and children, there was simply less foraging. And then, when large landowners from England arrived with their imported indentured laborers and slaves, they started altering the land wholesale. On these huge, royally granted estates, these early great landowners simply shifted populations around through war, land appropriation, and enslavement. You know, ancient Roman style. As 21st century people, it is hard to understand the layer of religious filters with which everyone, from the most pious deacon to the hardest military man or the most humble laborer, viewed the world in the 17th century. People saw clear relationships of how the forces of good and evil, God and the devil, affected their daily lives. It's much the same way we now regard soap and germs. They regularly attended to the cleanliness of their souls for health and sociability, the way we wash our hands and faces. As a result, they were primed to see the wild foods as God's miracle, and their abundance as approval of their actions. They had no reason, and often no resources, curiosity, or energy to look for clues that these foraging grounds were tended. So these tasty treasures were regarded as special, short-lived moments belonging to where that bush or that tree grew, and completely out of the control of any human. As domestication happened, farmsteads were established, only the tastiest stuff, the most dependable, and the plants that were amenable to orderly cultivation were brought inside the fences. The items that resisted domestication or required wandering about in the woods tended to be left behind. They would appear if and when they were supposed to. To the colonists, there was no idea of environment or biosphere or system. The world simply contained what it contained, and the New World was simply wild land waiting for order to be imposed upon it. Now it is my opinion, but one that has been growing as I read economic history, cookbooks, medical treatises, and chapters and essays on colonial trade, that it is this valuing of everything as a commodity or not that caused much of the variety of vegetable matter to be pushed off the American table right from the start, or to never even make it up there in the first place. These things that couldn't be a commodity, that were available to everyone, that were matters for women in the kitchen to attend to, how much were they? Could they be worth anyway? The colonies of the British Atlantic were started for the purpose of making people money. Even the people who funded the Pilgrims to head out to New England expected a return on the money that was shelled out to equip this colony of cranky religious refugees. And that is something I did not know when I started this project. And because of that preoccupation with what things are worth, what produce could be a cash crop was at the heart of English settlement, at the heart of a lot of European settlement in all the Americas. Those herbs and flowers and berries of the colonies were regarded as both too common and too perishable to be worth anything at all. And as the colonies were being founded, the habit of using pretty vegetables as a display of wealth had not reached England. And even if it had, such a habit would certainly have been disdained by the sort of hard men using axes to hew housing timbers and stockade walls. Did the long-term American lack of regard for vegetable cuisine have some of its roots in this founding pattern of thought? Our founding mythos meshes very well with the idea that while soft, decadent, continental aristocrats might be cooing over their adorable carrots and cauliflowers, and rich planters in Virginia and Barbados were displaying eggplants and tomatoes amongst spiced quails and seabirds, the practical Yankees were building America on practical plain fare that didn't include any yucky vegetables. But back here in the 21st century, something else is going on. We now have a craving for variety. Sure, we may have lost the plot on seasonality, fresh berries in February, tiny baby greens every day of the year, but the recognition that flavor is a virtue is reviving our curiosity for the greens and flowers and berries that have been there all along. We are uncovering, discovering, and recovering the plants that nourished the colonists, the tribes that were here first, and the enslaved people we uprooted and dropped here. But we have only been able to see these things growing right under our feet by at last seeking out those very people who were marginalized or even lampooned for keeping the knowledge of the greens and flowers and berries alive. We have come this close to losing the knowledge of the Native Americans and the enslaved West Africans through overconfidence, disdain, and ignorance. As we face global upheaval, at least as consequential as what went down in the 16th and 17th centuries, I'm really hoping we choose not to revisit that particular mistake. As with many other food categories we will travel through, when the floor is opened up to more voices, we all eat better. Now that we've made it through the spring bounty, it's time to move on to one of the first field harvests of the year, legumes. If you've ever wondered why edamame and fava beans have to be shelled and sometimes individually skinned, but you can eat green beans and limas and kidney beans with no fuss, then follow me on to next time. And I say next time because it's going to be every other week mode for the summer. We will be taking a look at the New World beans. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the show's email and the link to the show notes are in the show description and also on the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food.